Thank you for joining us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. This year marks the 10th year since countries negotiated a climate pact called the Paris Agreement. It is said that on the one hand, its impact is visible and tangible, while on the other, global emissions have continued to increase, and the lower range of the temperature targets set in the Paris Agreement is now widely considered as out of reach. In fact, 2025 is tied with 2023 as the second warmest year on record, continuing exceptionally high warming trend. 10 years on from the Paris Agreement, the report, A Decade of National Climate Action, Stocktake and the Road Ahead, analyzes what has been the real effect of the Paris Agreement on climate action. Nigeria is one of 21 countries whose national climate plans were analyzed by experts from the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative. We look at their findings today on the program, as well as the Paris Agreement within the last 10 years. Just stay with us. Before Paris, 186 countries submitted carbon reduction targets, known as Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, or INDCs, which outlined how each country would cut its carbon emissions. The goal is to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels.
Est positive, je n'entends pas d'objection. L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
Once those countries joined the Paris Agreement, those INDCs became Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. There is no one-size-fits-all approach for the NDCs, and different countries are taking climate action in different ways, from investing in renewable energy to introducing carbon taxes. The NDCs are to be updated every 5 years by parties to the agreement, and each new iteration is expected to be more ambitious than the previous one. Nigeria's third NDC, or NDC 3.0, is economy-wide, covering all greenhouse gases in Nigeria's inventory, and sets an ambitious target of a 32% reduction in emissions by 2035 compared to 2018 levels. This latest National Climate Action Plans aims to increase the share of renewable energy in electricity generation from 22 to 52%. The fact that all countries, including all major emitters, agreed to reduce their emissions was seen as a huge step forward. Another important aspect of the Paris Agreement is that for the first time, non-party stakeholders, everyone from businesses to regions and civil societies, were invited to start contributing towards climate action.
Your voices at that time. The landmark Paris Agreement on climate change has entered into force. At a time of record heat, member states embraced this new global agreement in record time.
Thank you very much.
However, President Trump pulled out the United States during his first term.
In order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
President Biden rejoined in 2021.
My determination to do just that.
And now, President Trump is pulling out again. Today, United States, being the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, will rejoin Iran, Libya, and Yemen as the only countries outside the agreement. The Paris Agreement adheres to the principle called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. It means that while there is a duty on all countries to take climate action, the types of action they take will depend on their different national circumstances. The flexibility in the agreement has meant that so far, Some countries have pledged to cut their net climate emissions to zero by 2050, while other countries have set other goals. Nigeria commits to achieving net zero emissions by 2060. The agreement also reaffirms that developed countries should take the lead in providing financial assistance to developing countries so they can take adequate measures to fight climate change, including investing in adaptation measures.
It is so decided.
The operational details for the practical implementation of the Paris Agreement were agreed on at the United Nations Climate Conference, COP24, in Katowice, in Poland, in December 2018, in what is colloquially called the Paris Rulebook.
Proposal is adopted as orally amended. A revised version, a written version, will be issued shortly. Hearing no objections, it is so decided.
And finalized at COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, in November 2021.
I invite the CMA to adopt the draft decision entitled Outcome of the First Global Stocktake, contained in document FCCPA/PA/CMA/2023/L.17. Hearing no objection, it is so decided.
In 2023, the first global stocktake of the world's efforts under the Paris Agreement concluded at COP28 with a decision on how to accelerate action across all areas, mitigation, adaptation and finance by 2030, including a call on governments to speed up the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy such as wind and solar power in the next round of climate commitments.
Loss and damage associated with climate change impacts.
In 2022, a new loss and damage fund to help vulnerable countries and communities was set up. It was operationalized in 2023.
The first plenary meeting of COP30.
And at COP30 in Belém, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage launched a call for funding requests. But despite being a cause for celebration, the stark reality is the fund must be filled with at least $400 billion a year. It currently has just $250 million. The past 11 years, between 2015 to 2025, individually have been the 11 warmest years in the 176-year observational record, with the past 3 years being the 3 warmest years on record. Experts warn that this means global climate pledges are still far off track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, leaving the world on course for a catastrophic 2.3 to 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Despite updated national climate action plans, climate progress has stalled, and the world remains dangerously close to losing the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal altogether.
What has been the real effect of the Paris Agreement 10 years after its signature? So when we look at this question, the first idea may be to turn to the global headlines, and the conclusions are well known. Some progress have happened since the Paris Agreement was signed, but emissions are still rising, and the 1.5 target is slipping out of reach. These conclusions are widely accepted, and we start from this acknowledgement. But we also want to recognize that they tell only one part of the story. They don't tell us why progress has been so uneven. They don't tell us what are the lessons we can draw to strengthen action. And the reason why it's so important is that this question is essential because it is at the core of the Paris Agreement, actually, to recognize that reaching the most ambitious climate goal depends on a learning process as a core lever for progressively increasing ambition. That's why to answer the question, we need to go beyond the analysis of global trends. We need to open the box of these trends. And given that the Paris Agreement was built on the decisions of individual countries, the real test is how it has reshaped national climate action.
The Paris Climate Agreement has provided the international framework for climate policy since 2015. It defines collectively agreed global goals and an innovative process to achieve these objectives, and has become a compass guiding government, businesses and citizens towards a net zero world. From a global perspective, the assessment of the Paris Agreement a decade after its adoption is mixed. Experts say these outcomes highlight the incomplete realization of the theory of change that lies at the core of the Paris Agreement, namely the assumption that the agreement creates conditions conducive to changes on the ground, which in turn reinforce the collective dynamics it promotes. Experts argue that the Paris Agreement has spurred the emergence and broad adoption of new approaches to climate governance at the national level. Climate-focused mandates, bodies and processes were once the exception. Today, approaches grounded in science, framed by a long-term perspective and involving diverse stakeholders have become much more widespread, helping to raise climate priorities in decision-making. Continued progress will depend on improving the effectiveness of these new forms of governance.
On the one hand, the analysis shows that the Paris Agreement has had a real impact. It has changed the way countries think and act on climate. There has been new governance processes being established. The long-term perspectives, which were not necessarily considered 10 years ago, are now really increasingly embedded in policy making. National policies have been implemented and have accelerated the spread of a number of low-carbon technologies and solutions. But on the other hand, the report also highlights some of the key shortcomings that can explain why the global trends are still off track, as consistently with the recognition we made at the beginning. The long-term strategies often remain disconnected from concrete policy decisions. Coordination across diversity of actors involved in climate action remains difficult. Policy actions don't consider enough some of the key levers for immediate emission reductions, such as dedicated actions on energy demand, some specific measures in some challenging sectors like the land use and agriculture, for example. Too little attention is given to some of the critical changes that will be critical for long-term ambitions, such as action on infrastructure and behaviors. And finally, social and industrial objectives continue largely to be seen as potentially contradictory to climate action, which obviously affects critically ambition and action in many countries.
Nigeria, United States, China, and 18 other countries were countries whose progress were analyzed in the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative's report tagged A Decade of National Climate Action Stocktake and the Road Ahead. It reveals that the Paris Agreement has spurred new approaches to climate governance and policy in countries. Nigeria's decade-long journey under the Paris Agreement is said to reflect both measurable progress and persistent challenges in aligning climate ambition with economic and social realities.
And by these architecture, we are referring to the Energy Transition Plan, the Climate Change Act, the NDC, the Long-Term Low Energy Economic Development Plan, the LTS, and more recently, the Just Transition Action Plan and Guideline. In addition to these pledges and policies, Nigeria is also beginning to make practical, tangible progress on ground. For example, through the Solar Niger, the Zungeru hydroelectric power station, there is still a lot of work to be done. There's still a huge gap for many countries, including Nigeria, in translating these policies, pledges into concrete, realizable, scalable action. And this is where effort needs to focus in the next years and decades. Nigeria is in a pretty challenging situation when it comes to climate change. I've sometimes described it as a double bind, in that if we fail to do something, we are doomed because we're a very, very vulnerable country. But also, if we act without clear understanding and insight, we may also be doomed, because even though, for example, oil accounts for nearly 5% or 5.7% of our GDP, it still accounts for about 85% of our foreign exchange earning. And this oil-based economy, this fossil fuel-based economy that we have, plus our long coastal line, our large and pervasive poverty, means that we are in a very precarious situation with respect to climate change. For example, 75% of our energy still comes from gas, fired power stations. And that's why, despite all the ambitions of the NDC and all of those things, you still see that our emissions have been climbing up and up from about 333 million metric tons in 2005 to now about 436 million metric tons. And this is even because when you remove the impact of the fossil fuel subsidy. And we find that because our oil has sort of rebounded, we are now doing nearly 2 million metric tons, barrels per day from 1.2 a few years ago. And then we've added Dangote refinery, which is a good thing for development, but it is processing about 650,000 barrels per day. So we still have this kind of chaotic, dance to the left and also dance to the right, where we are saying all the right things. And I think there is a sense of a desire to make progress. But the reality on the ground is that we are still tethered to our oil, and we have not made massive scalable investment to begin to wean ourselves from oil. And so we are still very, very vulnerable to global climate ambition.
The Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative says the Paris Agreement's stock-take approach involves assessing progress, acknowledging failures, and raising ambition. The initiative says this remains essential to accelerate the transformations needed. By taking stock of a decade of country-level action, the IDPP report aims to inform both national policy making and international processes, helping countries raise ambition in the decisive years ahead.
In fact, while the oil contributes about 5.7% of our GDP, it employs less than 1%. Whereas, if you were to pay strong and serious attention to production through the solar farms, you will be employing times maybe 20 or 40 of what oil is employing in order to produce the same amount of gigawatt of energy. So there are opportunities for economic growth through decarbonization and green industrialization. The idea that you have to choose between one or the other is false. It's a myth. Is it easy? No. But it requires conscientiousness, detailed planning, and articulation of how can we use our gas now as a bridge. That means if you're making investment in oil, you're also making a full investment in renewable energy. At the moment, I see one happening without the other, and that is the danger that I'm describing.
Nigeria's pathway is said to require deepening the synergy between domestic reform and international cooperation. Priorities include scaling adaptation and resilience investments, de-risking renewable and clean energy projects for private capital, expanding methane abatement programs, and ensuring industrial readiness for low-carbon trade regimens.
NCC should move from policy announcement to backable pipelines, hardwire carbon budgets, and de-risk renewable energy interventions. Enforce methane rules and stand up local currency and concessional finance, while fixing transmission and monitoring, reporting, and verification capacity within the country. So I will prioritize these into 5 points that NCC should look at. One, operationalize the 5 years carbon budget and national plan enshrined in the Climate Change Act, and align tariff with power purchasing agreement in terms of carbon budget, and also de-risk project by implementing the Electricity Act of 2033 provisions with standard PPA liquidity to support independent power producers. Then in terms of methane and flare out, there should be strict enforcement via the upstream decarbonization template and the Nigerian gas flare commercialization program. So all this should be accelerated. And the grid is in total Bismarck. Since nothing is really coming up there, so the grid should be modernized and make it smarter. And the only way to do this is to increase investment in transmission, metering, SCADA system to integrate renewable energy generation into the national grid. Then with this, I think the NCC should also look at implementing monitoring, reporting and verification and project prep to facilitate to unlock results, based finance and carbon markets. I think with this, Nigeria is on the right track to achieving the net zero emission by 2060.
Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels rose by a record amount in 2024, reaching new highs and locking in further long-term warming and extreme weather, according to the World Meteorological Organization. The WMO's latest greenhouse gas bulletin shows that carbon dioxide growth rates have tripled since the 1960s, accelerating from an annual average increase of 0.8 parts per million to 2.4 parts per million per year in the decade from 2011 to 2020. The rate jumped by a record 3.5 parts per million between 2023 and 2024, the largest increase since monitoring began in 1957. Average concentrations reached 423.9 parts per million in 2024, up from 377 parts per million when the bulletin was first published in 2004. Roughly half of carbon dioxide emitted remains in the atmosphere, while the rest is absorbed by land and oceans, storage that is weakening as warming reduces ocean solubility and worsens drought. It was said that the 2024 spike was likely amplified by an uptick in wildfires and a reduced uptake of carbon dioxide by land and the ocean in 2024, the warmest year on record, with a strong El Nino weather pattern effect. The WMO issued the report ahead of the COP30 climate conference in Berlin, Brazil, emphasizing that sustained global monitoring is vital for guiding climate action.
To the report, concentration of methane and nitrous oxide, which are the second and third most important long-lived greenhouse gases related to human activities, have also risen to record levels. WMO's Deputy Secretary General Kobe Barrett warned that the heat trapped by CO2 and other greenhouse gases is turbocharging our climate and leading to more extreme weather. He stressed that reducing emissions is therefore essential, not just for our climate, but also for our economic security and community well-being.
No country is safe from the devastating impact of extreme weather, and saving lives means making early warning systems accessible to all, the United Nations chief, Antonio Guterres, told the World Meteorological Agency in October.
One thing is already clear. We will not be able to contain the global warming below 1.5 degrees in the next few years. The overshooting is now inevitable, which means that we're going to have a period, bigger or smaller, with higher or lower intensity above 1.5 degrees in the years to come.
He said that just 24 hours notice before a hazardous event can reduce damage by up to 30%. In 2022, Mr. Guterres launched the Early Warnings for All initiative, aiming to ensure that everyone everywhere is protected by an alert system by 2027. Progress has been made, with more than half of all countries now reportedly equipped with multi-hazard early warning systems. The world's least developed countries have nearly doubled their capacity since official reporting began. But we have a long way to go, the UN chief acknowledged.
Reaching every community requires a surge in financing, but too many developing countries are blocked by limited fiscal space, slowing growth, crushing debt burdens, and growing systemic risks.
COP30 held during the 10th year of Paris Agreement. It was dubbed the Implementation Cup, the Adaptation Cup, the Forest Cup, the People's Cup, and the Cup of Truth. It meant different things to different people, just so it can deliver a positive for people and planet. An analysis says it's delivered in some areas and fell short in others. A reminder that the climate story is never without context. In a year without a headline mandate, negotiations in Belém became a test of whether the United Nations Convention on Climate Change process itself could hold, moving every piece of the climate architecture forward at once. Well, we've been told that strengthening international cooperation is critical to supporting greater climate ambition at the national level. And this requires an innovative approach that places the need and priorities of countries at the center. With that, we end today's show. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.